Now, with the Pacific Islands Forum in Tuvalu last week, the Pacific leaders have been keen to create the impression their islands are in mortal peril from climate change. And most of our media have been happy to oblige. Here's the ABC's Patricia Karvelis with Tuvalu Prime Minister Enele Sopoaga.
What impact is the changing climate having on your country right now? You talked about the urgency right now. What are you referring to?
People are about to be swollen into the sea because of erosion. And there is a tax on the food crops and also their actual livelihoods, households, and there is anxiety. We've been saying these things for so many years.
Swallowed by the sea? This is alarmist and misleading stuff. I mean, even an ABC fact check last year confirmed that in the 4 decades to 2014, Tuvalu's total land area grew by 73 hectares, or 2.9%. Most of its islands are getting bigger, not smaller, and this came from a widely reported University of Auckland study based on satellite imagery. Unfortunately, in the 13-minute interview, this reality was not put to Prime Minister Sopoaga for a response. In fact, none of his dire assertions were challenged. And like many journalists, plenty of politicians are keen to talk up the crisis regardless of the evidence.
The Pacific Island leaders aren't being rhetorical when they say this is an existential crisis for them. They have whole communities that are having to leave islands that they've lived on for generations because water levels are rising. It's affecting the supply of fresh water on those islands. It's affecting the sort of crops they can grow.
Have a think about what's happening to the Pacific Islands at the moment. They are literally watching the ocean creep up towards their homes.
If you are a Pacific Islander and your home is going to be washed away by rising sea levels caused by global warming, then this is not a political issue, it's an existential one.
Cartoonists too couldn't help the dramatic but fallacious images of islands swamped by the oceans, with Nine newspapers' Kathy Wilcox also suggesting Australia is doing nothing on carbon emissions. And the Australian's John Kudelka worried the rising tides will wash away Australia's aid funding. The Pacific Island nations didn't want much. They just demanded that Australia shut down its largest export industry.
A discussion so far as I know now, within the groups of the forum, by members of the forum, is to call on Australia to end coal mining, not to open new coal mining.
Of course, even if we did shut down our coal industry, global emissions would continue to rise. In other words, it would make no difference to whatever changes may or may not occur. That's how inane all this posturing is. And rather than challenge this nonsense, much of our media cheered it on, even as New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern sought glory at Australia's expense.
The language was civil enough, but Jacinda Ardern has firmly put Scott Morrison in his place as the New Zealand Prime Minister spelled out what she thinks Australia should do about climate change.
Every single little bit matters, and so that is why New Zealand has joined that international call. It is why we speak, I believe, strongly on the international stage around these issues, but ultimately we all have to take responsibility ourselves.
Well, it's hard to characterise that as putting Morrison firmly in his place, but summaries like that, which are very common, do raise the question of why so many in our media insist on supporting attacks against their own country, no matter how illogical or hypocritical those criticisms happen to be. My old boss, former Foreign Affairs Minister Alexander Downer, is still on Australia's side, tweeting, "Sad to see Jacinda Ardern taking shots at the Pacific Island Forum. She knows only too well she's asking us to bear a huge cost. How is it in her country's interest to virtue signal against her country's best friend? We know why she did it." Nine newspapers' AFL writer Andrew Stafford responded hysterically, "Because our Pacific neighbours are sinking into the sea and soon to become climate refugees. Perhaps you assume New Zealand will bear that cost all by themselves." Let's hope Stafford knows more about footy than he does about Pacific Islands affairs and climate change politics. And as I showed you last night, despite all its political point scoring, Labor has revealed it wouldn't have given the Pacific Islands what they wanted either.
Oh, of course not. I mean, coal remains an important industry for Australia, and it remains part of the global energy mix.
Penny Wong selling coal to Newcastle there. Thankfully, a handful of reporters and commentators dared to mention the obvious hypocrisy of the Pacific Island nations castigating Australia over coal while cozying up to China, which doesn't mind a bit of the useful black rock.
Australia produces 7.7% of the world's coal and China 47%. Australia accounts for a tick over 1% of global coal consumption, China just over half. Last year, China consumed more coal every 9 days than Australia consumed in a year.
And where the bulk of emissions come from, that's what's threatening the world's climate.
Beijing's representatives were at the forum and talked up their nation's commitment to action on climate change. But they were asked no hard questions because the region is now so dependent on China's trade and its cash, which Australia finds frustrating because it invests far more in the Pacific and defends its fragile economies.
We are protecting their resources. There are nations whose nationals are out stealing the Pacific's fish.
Guess who?
Guess who, indeed. And while much of the Australian political and media class bagged their own country, it took New Zealand's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister to provide a reality check.
There are many Pacific countries that are seeking loans, cheap loans from China. Now, those loans are on the backs of coal-fired everything in mainland China, as we well know. What I'm sadly hearing is variations on a theme which is somewhat saying that they're all attacking the Australian Prime Minister, or that they've all taken the view, including New Zealand's Prime Minister, that the Australians are somehow acting incorrectly, when that is not the proper picture or the real picture at all. But let's make no bones about it. Australia has been a great neighbour in the Pacific. They've put a lot of effort and a lot of care and a lot of attention and a lot of sound foreign policy over for decades into the Pacific. Before some people rush to judgment, they should remember that. Remember who has been their long-term and their short-term friend.
Winston Peters, Jacinda Ardern's coalition partner, of all people, defending Australia by referring people to the relevant facts. But isn't that supposed to be the media's job? Whose side do you think they're on?